Today's episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.anxietydiariespodcast.com/audible. Hello and welcome to Anxiety Diaries, a weekly podcast about mental health, incredible people, and so much more. I'm your host, Scott Newmeyer, and this is episode 21. If you like what you hear, please subscribe. And if you get a chance, head over to Apple Podcasts to rate and review the show. It really does help us, and we really do appreciate it. Today on the podcast, I'm going to tell you the story of what I consider my worst panic attack I've ever had. I don't want to say too much about it, to be honest, until I get into the story. Just listen, and I hope you like it. Next week, we'll be back with a brand new episode and a brand new guest. We've got a great string of shows coming up for you, so please make sure you stick around. Tell your friends. If you didn't already know, we've recently released several different t-shirt designs for the podcast. You can head over to anxietysucksshirt.com to check out one of them, and there are also links on our Instagram page for the other design as well. A portion of the proceeds go to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and the rest of the proceeds go back into this podcast to help keep it going. So if you want to check that out, please do. Otherwise, stick around and you'll get to hear about the worst panic attack I've ever had. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So when I say this was my worst panic attack that I ever had, I guess that's a little bit of hyperbole. I don't really know if this is the absolute worst panic attack I ever had. I can tell you that it was a really bad one for me physically, mentally, and it really drained me. The reason I say that it's my worst is because I really remember it really vividly. You might think that the panic attack I described in the very first episode of this podcast, the first panic attack that I truly internalized before going to get help, realizing I had anxiety disorder, all these things, you might think that that would be the worst one. Thinking back on it now, I really don't think that that was physically the worst panic attack I ever had. It was memorable, obviously, because it was the first one I truly internalized. And it was in a situation where I felt like I was helpless. I couldn't get out of it. But that wasn't physically that hard, to be honest. I got through the night. I felt okay. It was uncomfortable, but it was not the worst. It was just the first. You always remember your first. So there have been many others since that first panic attack many years ago. Everyone varies in severity and symptoms. Everything's different every single time, and a lot of times they come out of nowhere. But this particular panic attack did not come out of nowhere. I knew it was coming. I almost set myself up for it. So let me rewind a little bit and tell you about the place that we go almost every summer. There's a place in New Jersey called Stone Harbor. It's a little tiny shore town just before Cape May, just before Wildwood. It's a beautiful little town, very quiet and calm. Honestly, it's my favorite place on earth. If I could live there, I would live there. It exists on this little tiny island called 7 Mile Island, along with Avalon, which is another beautiful shore town. So my wife and her family have been going to this town for many years, long before I started dating her. And we kind of inherited this tradition when we started dating and when we got married, that we would continue the tradition of going down there every summer. And the first summer that I went there, she was still dealing with the symptoms of panic and anxiety disorder that summer, and I was not. But she did great. She did great. We went there and we had a great time. And then several subsequent summers, we went back there and we had a great time. This is the place where I proposed to my wife on the beach. This is the place where we went on our honeymoon. When I say this is my favorite place on earth, it really is my favorite place on earth. But ever since I've been anxious, part of the problem is not being there. Once I'm there, I'm usually fine. Part of the problem is getting there. Driving the 2.5, 3 hours down there, down the New Jersey Parkway, over the bridge into Stone Harbor is a really difficult drive for me. And it has been for several years. I have not been there in several years now. And I do plan to go back. I vow to go back. But it's been a couple of years since I've been there. And I do remember one of the last few years that I had gone there. I remember us planning the summer trip. This was before we had our first child. So this was not the last time we were there, but it was one of the last couple of years that we had been there. So we had been planning the trip all summer, It was coming closer and closer, and I was still dealing with major anxiety. I was still really in the deepness of my anxiety disorder, dealing with panic and anxiety, trying to leave the house, things like that. Just going to work was difficult for me. I knew it was coming closer and closer every day. The anticipatory anxiety was really taking a toll on me, but I didn't realize how much of a toll it was taking on me until the morning that we had to leave. So the night before, I remember being up almost all night. I remember laying in bed and thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to do this? This is going to be way too hard. There's no way I can do this. Just horrible negative thoughts going through my head over and over again, all night long pretty much. So I didn't really get any sleep. As you know from listening to this podcast already, negative thoughts are what make dealing with anxiety even harder, because your brain is literally lying to you, telling you you can't do something, telling you you should not be confident in doing something, telling you that you're worthless or that you can't do it. And I let those thoughts get to me, and I let them get to me all night long. We were planning to leave at 8, 9 in the morning, early, because we wanted to get there. It was probably between 8 and 10 in the morning. So I remember that morning, my wife waking up, taking her shower, all that kind of stuff, putting her makeup on and finishing up the last little bit of packing the bags we would usually bring in the car. I remember me laying in bed just procrastinating, being nervous, and just saying that, the longer I lay in bed, the better off I am. The longer I lay here, the farther away it is. And as we got closer and closer, I remember just feeling worse and worse. And I remember my legs physically shaking. I don't know if that was a psychosomatic reaction to my anxiety. I don't know if I was doing it out of some type of physical reaction to my mental state, but I don't remember doing it voluntarily. But my legs were just shaking. And I remember we were getting close to the time to leave, and she was on the phone with her parents, because we would always go. It would be me and her mother. And then we would have a couple other people come down throughout the week. Her brother would often come with us. And that time, I remember her being on the phone and me just getting worse and worse and not feeling like I was capable of doing this. Part of my anxiety is also the fact that it's a control thing for me, and I need to be able to drive. I'm not comfortable with someone else driving. It makes me feel sick. It makes me feel out of control. So while the drive down to Stone Harbor is very difficult for me, it's also imperative in my mind that I must be the one driving. So that morning, she had just talked to her mother, and we had set up when we were going to leave and pick up her mom and all this stuff. So the car was packed, and my leg is still shaking, and I'm sitting there, and I start breaking down. The car was packed. We were ready to get going in probably another 10 minutes. My leg is still shaking, and I just start to break down. I just started crying. And I looked at her, and the tears were welling up in my face. She knew exactly how I was feeling. My hands were sweaty. My palms were sweaty. My heart was beating. I felt sick to my stomach because my anxiety always starts in my stomach. And I remember looking at her and just saying, I can't do this. There's no way I can do this. I'm not going. It's not happening. No, 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 no. I'm not leaving. You're going to have to go without me. I'll stay here for the week. And I think about this now. It's kind of difficult even to talk about this, because not that I don't want to share it with you. I'm totally fine with sharing every single step through this journey that I've taken. I'm totally fine with opening every single wound that I've had and every weak moment that I've had, so you can see what it's like to feel that way and to know that it's okay and it gets better. But I still think about this moment and think about how terrified I was, how scared I was. I was a husband, a late 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, early 30s man, laying in my bed, my legs shaking, and tears literally streaming down my face, telling my wife I was not strong enough to drive 2 hours to go to vacation for a week. And I'm just bawling. It may not seem that strange. I mean, I've always been one of those people who says it doesn't matter who you are, male, female, it doesn't matter. Crying is good. You should cry and get it out. But you should also know that I don't cry often. It's very difficult to make me cry, unless you put on the series finale of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because that gets me every single time. But I'm not a crier for the most part. I don't show my emotion that way. And at this moment, I just felt such weakness, just such weakness. I had zero confidence whatsoever. All these negative thoughts all night. The lizard brain had been telling me all night that I was never going to do it, that I was going to fail, that I was not going to have any way out of it, that I wasn't in control. And I felt it all night, and I let it manifest all night. And then that morning it came out. But my wife she had been through this before. She had dealt with panic and anxiety. She looked at me and she said, "You're coming. You don't have a choice." I mean, I literally put her through hell that morning because I know it was very difficult for her to say that to me. I'm sure she felt guilty about it. She wanted, her husband sitting there in front of her crying that he's scared to go on vacation, to drive down to vacation. Part of her probably wanted to say, "Okay, you can stay. It's okay. Stop crying. You're okay." But she knew that if she did that, I would never overcome what I needed to overcome, and I would never do it. So she said, you're doing it. You're going, and it's not an option. You can get in the car. I'll drive. You can sleep the whole way, whatever you need to do. And I cried for a bit more, and I got a bit more upset, and my leg was still shaking. And at the time, I've had a Xanax prescription for a long time. But there was a big part of me that never wanted to take it for a very long time. I'll get into this more in another episode, but the reason for that had nothing to do with feeling ashamed of taking medication. I think if you need medication, you should take it, and that's great. But the reason that I did that was because that Xanax was always my safety blanket. If I took that Xanax and it didn't help, then what's left? What is left? If it doesn't help me, then where do I turn? That was always my feeling back then. I've changed my feelings quite a bit since then. And like I said, I'll talk about this in another episode, I'm sure, but that's how I felt at the time. So I was never taking anything like that. But that morning, this panic attack was so bad, so physically exhausting, so draining and so upsetting. I was just so scared, man. I was so scared that I took a half a Xanax, and a very small amount. I take a prescription of 0.5 milligrams. So I took like half of that. And within 15 minutes, we were in the car on the road, and I was calming down a little bit. We started driving, we stopped and grabbed some donuts or bagels or something on the way. And I was okay. Like, I was still scared. I was still really scared. I could still feel that tension in my body, like wound up like a knot. I could still feel it, but I wasn't so scared that I couldn't drive and I couldn't pay attention to where we were and what we were doing. I wasn't so scared that I couldn't be a safe driver and get us down there. But I do remember about halfway there, you're going down the parkway and it starts to get congested once you get down the shore, especially towards Atlantic City. It starts to get congested. There's a lot of traffic. And you start to feel a little bit more trapped, at least for me. And I do remember getting just really nervous at one point and tears welling up in my eyes. But I knew I couldn't turn back at this point. There was nowhere to turn around. There was nowhere to go. I had to just see this through. So I just kind of pushed those tears back in my eyes. I didn't let them fall this time. And I pushed through. And we drove the 2.5 hours. We made good time. We crossed the bridge and we got to Stone Harbor safely. And I got through it. The worst panic attack I ever remember feeling that way. I don't remember ever getting to a point where I was so scared that I was just bawling, other than this time. And I did it. We got there and I felt fine and we had a great week. It was fun. And the drive home is never scary like that because you're coming home. And the reason I tell you this story isn't because I'm a masochist and I love to recount all these really difficult times. I don't revel in that. It's not fun to recount that. But the reason I tell you this story is because I want you to know that if you're sitting on your bed and your leg is shaking and you're crying or there's tears welling up in your eyes, whether you're a kid, a teenager, parent, elderly, a man, a woman, transgender, whatever you are, it doesn't matter. You can do this. If you want to cry, cry. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to have those feelings. And that's why I'm telling you the story, because I want you to know that. I think one of the things back then for me that made me so scared and made this panic attack so much worse was that other than my wife who had been there and done this, other than her telling me that it was okay to feel the way I was feeling and to do the things I was doing, other than her telling me that, I don't think anybody else was telling me that. I don't think anyone else really understood what I was going through. And that's probably how you feel sometimes. So I want you to know that I understand. I feel how you feel. I felt how you feel. I get it. I know it's hard and I know you're scared, but I promise you that you can do it. You really can. I never imagined I'd be able to make that drive that morning. And I did it. And I've done it several times since then. It's been a few years since I've done it now. And I know there's going to be a time when I need to do it again, sooner than later. I know I'm going to have some of those same feelings. I don't think it'll be as difficult as it was that time. I don't think I'll be bawling. I think I know a better way to manage that now. But I know I'm going to have those feelings. But at the end of the day, I know I can do it. So that's why I shared this story today, because I wanted you to know that. I wanted you to know that you can overcome that fear. You can get behind the wheel. You can drive those 2.5 hours. You can get on the plane. You can get up in the air and fly for 6 hours. You can do literally anything you want to do. You just have to believe that you can do it. Back then, I didn't believe it. Now I do. And that's why I'm doing this. So I hope that helps. I hope you find that information helpful. Like I said, I don't know if that was physically really the worst panic attack I've ever had, but that one always sticks out in my head as one that was really hard for me to deal with, really hard for me to reconcile. I still think back to those tears streaming down my face and that leg shaking in that bed. And I just think to myself, man, that was really, really difficult. But I overcame it, and you will too. So I hope that story helps you a little bit, and I hope you understand that whether you've had panic attacks that are worse or not as bad as that, whether you're having them now, no matter what it is you're doing, no matter what it is you're feeling, your feelings are valid, you're going to be okay, and you can do it. I promise. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week. Call us, leave us a message at 732-903-4441, or drop us an email at anxietydiariespodcast@gmail.com. You can find the podcast at www.anxietydiariespodcast.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter as well. And you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Anxiety Diaries Podcast. We're also on Twitter at Anxiety Diary Pod. Thanks again for listening. Be well, and we'll see you next week.